Welcome to our second learning burst on April 30th. This is our second gardening learning burst, and we're going to spend some time today talking about some basic gardening concepts. So we'll focus more on container gardening. We talked about it some last week, but I wanted to dive into it a little bit more than I did last week. We'll talk about insects, some insects you're going to see in your garden this year, and some organic ways to deal with them. And then we'll end talking about food forest. What is a food forest? What might that look like at your childcare center or even your home? And so, for those of you that don't know me, my name is Kyle Hood. I'm the Garden Collaborative Extension Associate with the Steps to Health program here at NCSU. And yeah, let's dive right into it and start with container gardening. Again, we did just briefly talk about container gardening last learning burst a week ago, but I wanted to sort of drill down into container gardening concepts, give you a little bit more information, maybe make you feel more comfortable in your container gardening endeavors this year. And so one of the first things I want to think about when I'm starting my containers each year is what am I going to put inside my containers? What's my growing media going to be? And growing media just means what are my plants going to grow in? So, obviously, if I'm doing in-ground gardening, that growing media is, the native soil. When I'm doing container gardening, that is a little bit more complicated. And the main reasons that becomes complicated is because I need good drainage and aeration in my containers for them to be successful. And so if I just try to dig a hole in my backyard, put that soil in a container, I'm going to have a lot of issues with aeration and drainage because native soil is not meant to be in that confined space. Water is going to get clogged up in there, airflow is not going to freely move through it. So usually the easiest solution for choosing my growing media for my containers is just to pick some type of potting soil that is very specifically designed to have good drainage and good aeration for my plants in my pots. Compost is also a great thing to put in my pots as well. Even the 50-50 mix of potting soil and compost would be totally fine. And then, thinking about my container gardens this year, you obviously want to have the right size garden container for whatever you're growing. And if I look at this really handy chart over here on the right, I can see pretty quickly kind of the minimum size container I need to grow just about any vegetable I can think of. So what we're going to do is we're going to pretend potatoes are not on this list because they just kind of throw the math off a little bit. But if I exclude potatoes, then the biggest size container I need for anything on this list, which is again almost everything you grow in a vegetable garden, is 5 gallons. So if I have my 5 gallon container that is 2 feet tall, then I can really grow every single garden vegetable that I could really think of. And so if you're really unsure about what size containers to get, getting some 5 gallon grow bags, which I discussed last week, is a really inexpensive option to start your container gardening endeavors. Maybe you get 10 5 gallon grow bags, and now I can grow everything I see on this list effectively. Whereas, some things take up more space than others. I can still at least fit one large tomato plant in my 5 gallon grow bag. Um, but this list just gives you a nice idea of what's the minimum size I need to effectively grow a lot of the different vegetables in my garden this year. So when we work with containers, they have certain properties that other types of gardening doesn't really have. And by that, I mean containers act differently than a raised bed garden or an in-ground garden. And that's for a few different reasons. Containers obviously have the most surface area per volume of any of the options I just talked about. Because really, almost the entirety of my root system and in a container is exposed to a surface area. And that makes them act differently. That makes them heat up and cool down faster than a raised bed garden or an in-ground garden. And in the summertime, that can be an advantage because things like tomatoes and beans and squash and corn, they thrive in warm soil temperatures. So 70 to 80 temperature soil, they're doing really well. They like that. And so potentially my tomatoes and things like that could get a head start in container gardening. That's also going to mean though in the spring and fall, they cool down they cool down faster than some other types of gardening. So a deep freeze could easily freeze my whole garden if I have a container garden. The other thing they do is they dry out faster. All that surface area is great, but it's also going to cause me to dry out faster than I maybe would um, for some other methods. And when I'm filling my containers, I want to leave an inch of space at the top of that container. And that's going to be space for watering. Because if I fill my container up all the way with whatever growing media I select, and then I water it, now my potting soil or compost mix is going to spill out of the sides of that growing container. So leave some space for water in your containers. You can also recycle growing media year to year. And you do this in a few ways. One of the easiest ways to do it is just to take all of your growing media from last year and mix it with 50% of a new growing media like compost or raised bed soil or potting soil, um, something similar. And that way you're not having to just completely rebuy it every single year. If I have a really big grow bag, like those 5 gallon grow bags I mentioned, you could honestly probably just top it off with some fresh compost or fresh potting soil every year, a few inches of it, and some fertilizer, and that would probably work really well. Um, but just know you don't really need to buy all new potting soil each year for your container gardens. So let's talk about some garden critters that you'll see this summer that might give you or cause you some issues in your garden. And we'll focus on the critters now, their life cycle, and then afterwards we'll talk about some ways to deal with them organically. And the first one we're going to mention is the squash vine borer. This is a nightmare in your garden if you've ever experienced this before. If you don't know about them, they bore into the stems of squash plants or really any plant in the cucurbit family. So you're thinking watermelons, cucumbers, squash, zucchini, cantaloupes, all that good stuff. Some of our favorite summer vegetables. They bore into the stems, and the first visual symptom you'll often see of their damage is that part of your plant, the leaves on that part of the plant will start wilting. And they might bounce back, but then they'll eventually die pretty quickly. If you see that, you might want to check the stems of your plant. And their damage is very obvious. I'll show you a picture of what squash vine borer damage looks like here in a minute, but it's unmistakable their damage when you see it and kind of learn what it looks like. Um, This is the real culprit here, the squash vine borer moth. It's really pretty. It kind of looks like a tiger, and it's a really fun thing to keep an eye out for at your house or your childcare center. A really striking insect. But this is going to lay its eggs on the stems or maybe the leaves of my squash plants. And when they hatch, they're going to bore right into the stems like we talked about. So you want to keep an eye out for them if you see one. and you have squash plants in your garden, definitely go ahead and take precautions. And this is what squash vine borer damage looks like. Again, it's unmistakable. You're going to find holes at the base of your squash plant, and you'll see this sort of orangey discharge coming out of the holes in your squash plant or pumpkin plant. And that is what one of the squash vine borers look like. You will often not see them. They'll be hiding inside the squash vines. So actually just walking by and seeing a squash vine borer out is pretty rare, but that's what the damage looks like. That's what one actively feeding looks like. So the next insect you might see this summer in your garden is the cucumber beetle. And in North Carolina, there's really two types of cucumber beetles that you might see. This one on the left is the spotted cucumber beetle, and on the right, that's a striped cucumber beetle. And the spotted cucumber beetle looks a lot like a ladybug, but as we know, ladybugs are friends to our garden. They eat aphids. They're a good problem to have. They're a good insect to see. These spotted cucumber beetles and striped are the opposite. They're going to cause issues in your garden if left to their own devices. And the adults feed on the leaves of your plants. There is only one generation a year in that sort of late to midsummer, and they're only 0.2 inches long, so they're pretty small, around the same size as a ladybug. And one telltale sign that you have an issue with these guys is that you will see the leaves of your squash plants or cucurbit plants weeping, very similar to the same weeping you'd see from squash vine borer damage. If you see this happening and you don't see the holes from the squash vine boring, you might have bacterial wilt. And this is a disease that cucumber beetles carry with them and can sort of transfer to your plants. And if you see this happening, your leaves might recover for a few days and then all die in parts of your plant. You're going to want to cut all the affected areas off and hope it has not spread to other parts of your plants. This is a really grainy picture, but this is what these cucumber beetles damage looks like when they're actually feeding on your leaves. So one, they could carry diseases onto your squash plants, and two, they can actually eat the leaves of your squash plants, doing kind of, double damage there. Then we have the tomato hornworm, which is uh, a worm that's going to eat your leaves and stems of your tomato plants. And this is a really striking insect. They can be up to 4 inches long when they're adults. But if they're left unattended and you have enough of them, they can really do some damage to your tomato plants. And so what is really happening is that once they've fed all summer, they sort of burrow into the ground and emerge next year as moths. And these moths, which we'll see here, they're going to lay their eggs on the leaves and stems of your tomato plants. Uh, a bunch of these young tomato hornworms will pop out and start munching away on your tomatoes. When those tomato hornworms are young, they'll be a solid green, like this one we see here that has a lot of interesting shapes, and some of them have white shapes on their sides. The young ones will be a solid green, but in either instance, they will eat your tomato plants, and you want to have a plan for them when you see them. While I'm talking about tomato hornworms, I did just want to mention in here parasitoid wasps, and these are a beneficial garden insect. And this is a big family of wasps that I didn't put a picture of because they have so many different shapes and sizes. The important thing here, though, is that these wasps, they use other organisms to complete their life cycle. And so they will kill something like a tomato hornworm, and then they'll lay its eggs on that hornworm. And this picture is an example of that. That's a tomato hornworm. that has been killed by a parasitoid wasp, and its eggs are now being laid on that hornworm. I've only ever seen this in person once in my whole life, so this is a pretty rare event. But if you do see this, definitely a great time for a learning opportunity for the kids in your class. Uh, and so these tomato hornworm moths are going to lay their eggs in your tomatoes more in that midsummer. Um, so, we're not too far away from that now, but definitely worth checking your tomato plants once or twice a week, seeing if you see any eggs on their leaves, if you see any, feeding damage. Um, Good chance it could be a tomato hornworm on there. And this is what the damage they do looks like. They're essentially eating all the leaves and all the stems of the areas they're in. Again, a really striking insect that can be up to 4 inches long. Another great learning opportunity if you see one in your garden. So we talked about some insects. So let's talk about some ways to control insects organically. And when we're talking about pest management in our garden, leveraging nature, making nature work for us, helping us is a big component of organic gardening. And no better way to do that than using birds to your advantage and trying to attract birds to your garden. And if I have an active bird population around my garden, it's going to reduce the number of garden pests that I deal with every year. Because birds in North Carolina, they will eat just about every single garden pest you can think of. Every garden pest I just mentioned is part of different birds' diets. So, um, attracting them can really help reduce that pest pressure in my garden. And birds want three things. If I'm going to attract a bird to my garden, I need to be providing shelter. That could be a birdhouse, that could be, trees around that they can go to. Maybe I have a fence nearby they can go hang out on. They also want food. So obviously a bird feeder is a great way to do that. Maybe I have a deck where I put bird seed on the rails of that deck. Bonus points if my garden's right beside that or underneath it. And then they want water as well. So a bird bath is a great way to provide water for them. Lots of creative ways to provide shelter, food, and water for birds. But that's what they're going to want to keep coming back to your garden and to get them working for you as that pest control fighter jet, if you will. So now let's talk about some organic pest controls besides birds. So this is a product called diatomaceous earth, and essentially it's crushed up fossils that are sharp to insects. This is not toxic to humans. You don't want to breathe it in, but it's similar to the texture of flour or baby powder. You just want to make sure if you're having the kids use this at your center that their face isn't right beside it in the same way they shouldn't be inhaling flour, right? So it's not toxic to humans. If a human touches it with their fingers, it's not sharp to us. But if an insect walks in this, gets it on their shell, it's going to cut away at them and eventually kill them. It works best on younger insects. So you want to be identifying insects when they're first getting on your plants and then applying diatomaceous earth. With this product and really any of these pest control products that I'm talking about, you want to identify the insect or critter you want to kill before you apply the product. Because a product like this will kill most insects it comes into contact with. So, you know, I don't want to put this on there before I see an issue. I want to put it on there to deal with an issue. And slugs is a really, prominent issue all across North Carolina. This was this product would do a great job of dealing with slugs. If I see slug damage, if I see slugs, now I can apply this either around my plant or on the leaves of my plant. Many people take something like, a plastic container, poke holes in it, and apply this like they would a salt shaker essentially, and just shake it on their leaves or shake it on the ground around the plant. You just want those insects to be crawling through this and getting coated in it. So this can help deal with lots of different things like slugs, beetles, ants, aphids, flea beetles. If you have issues with flea beetles, putting this on your leaves will help kill them. They can be a pretty big garden menace this time of year. And you want to make sure you're buying food grade diatomaceous earth for your garden, which is safe to be using in your garden, safe for human contact, things like that. Another organic pesticide is neem oil, and this is derived from the seed of the neem tree. You want to make sure that when you're using neem oil, again, you know what you're targeting. This combats a wider range of insects than maybe diatomaceous earth. So things like caterpillars, beetles, leaf miners, a lot of young insects is what neem oil can target. And what's going to happen is you're going to spray this product on the leaves of your plant, and insects are going to get coated in it and essentially suffocate. So with both of the last two products we mentioned, diatomaceous earth and neem oil, you want to know what you're targeting, and you want to try to target insects when they're younger because it's going to be more effective. Then the third organic pest solution we're going to talk about is Bacillus thuringiensis. I'm just going to call this BT for the rest of this slide, but this is essentially BT spray is what people refer to as. And this is a naturally occurring bacteria that's completely safe for human contact. And this bacteria is going to be sprayed onto the leaves of your plant or the stem of your plant. And you want to spray this where you know worms or caterpillars are going to eat. So let's look at the squash vine borer, for example. This is a product that will kill squash vine borers. The nice thing about this is that bacteria is only harmful to worms and caterpillars. So it's not going to kill my ladybugs or some other beneficial insects around my garden. For squash vine borer, I would spray this onto the stem of my squash plants. And as soon as those squash vine borers start to eat the stem where I've sprayed this, they'll ingest this bacteria and it'll kill them. So this is a really great targeted solution that's not harmful to humans. That will help me deal with things like cabbage loopers, tomato hornworms, and squash vine borers. But again, this is more effective on younger caterpillars and younger worms. Adults, it might not kill an adult tomato hornworm, for example. So the last topic that we're going to touch on is a food forest. And this is a topic that we just briefly mentioned last week, but I just want to explain the concept and give you an idea of what this could look like at your childcare center or even your home. And essentially, this is a garden that's designed to mimic a natural forest. And it does that in a few different ways. One important way is it has plants growing at different levels of my space. And oftentimes vegetable gardens can kind of work in that same way. This takes that to a larger scale and a larger level, but it has plants growing on the bottom, you know, mid-size and the top of this area and even in the roots. So we'll look at a picture here in a minute that kind of visually explains this concept really well. But very often we're talking about in a food forest edible perennial plants that are easy to grow and easy to maintain. And so this is a visual representation of what a food forest can look like. So we'll go sort of layer by layer, starting with the top. And at the very top, we're talking about the canopy, the large trees in our food forest. And we're thinking about edible trees, trees that produce edible food that are large, things like pecans, apple trees, pear trees, good examples of those larger trees, 30 to 50 feet tall, some even taller than that. On my lower tree layer, layer number two, now I'm talking about dwarf, probably fruit trees. So maybe a dwarf apple tree that's going to be 10 to 20 feet tall, maybe a dwarf pear tree. And as we get lower in our food forest, now we're talking about our shrub layer. So things like, blueberry bushes, a fig bush, maybe a grapevine that's going to be, climbing on something, but still kind of be a little taller, but create sort of that bush-like structure. Then we go a little lower to our herbaceous layer. So things like, perennial herbs that form woody bushes are a good example. Things like oregano, lavender, rosemary, sage, all of those are really good herbaceous perennial herbs that are useful, don't take much maintenance, and can come back year after year. Then we're looking at our soil cover, our ground cover, things that take up space but don't need constant maintenance. So this is the opposite of grass. A good example of this would be chocolate mint, which covers the ground, never gets too tall, but can act, as a walkway or that in between space. Something like a clover is not really edible, but makes a great ground cover, good a good natural walkway that does not take human maintenance really. Doesn't ever need to be cut if you don't want to cut clover. Strawberries are another really great one that kind of spread out across the ground and obviously produce food. Then we're down to our last layer, that root layer, and this is really fungi and root vegetables. In this example, they have carrots and radishes here, but there's definitely other options for this as well. And so I just kind of put together an example plan. You could do 100 different things with this plan. This is just one version, starting at the bottom and working our way up in our food forest. And so on my root layer, I have some carrots and rhubarb. Rhubarb has a really deep root system. It is a perennial plant, really easy to grow. Rhubarb's delicious to cook with. On my ground cover layer, I have a mixture of mint and clover. Mint being a plant I could cook with, I could make tea out of, I can eat raw. It takes no effort to grow mint. And then clover is going to be my sort of walking paths that I'm not going to need to mow constantly. It's going to kind of keep up with itself. My herbaceous layer is going to consist of lavender and rosemary. We already talked about that. I'll have blueberries in my shrub layer. My lower tree layer, I'll have a dwarf apple tree or two. Really, you want two dwarf apple trees of different varieties, but that's a different conversation. And then in my canopy layer, I'd go with some pecans and full-grown pear trees to be that top area that kind of shades out the rest. And so that's just a really quick introduction into food forests, what they can look like. But thanks for coming to today's learning burst, and I'll see you all soon.